Perhaps you're wondering and you're thinking, the big four, the subjects that will decide whether you become a chartered accountant. Of course, you need to nail it. But how exactly do you do it? In today's video, I've got the pleasure to inform you that I'll be sharing an exact detail of what I used to do with one of the subjects, namely auditing. Now, if any of you have realized and done auditing, you will understand how difficult it can be and the nuances that it might entail. And I'm going to actually explain my journey with the subject, what I learned from it, and specifically some of the advice that I think you could benefit from. Firstly, we'll be looking at the misconceptions around unlearning some of the negative habits if you want to be successful in auditing. Secondly, we'll then look at the importance of being able to do questions and ultimately do them diligently. Thirdly, the art of consulting and how you can get the most out of auditing as a subject. Then fourthly, from there, we'll then look at the perspective of how do I then use specific advice in terms of the topics. So we'll look at what are the specific areas that get examined. And this is where the value will truly be in the video, because we'll actually look at some of the topics within auditing and some of the advice that I can give you that you can apply today to be successful. Then lastly, we'll end off with some general advice, and make sure you watch till the end so that you can get the full benefit. So let's go straight into it. I guess the first thing that we need to look at if we want to be successful in a subject like auditing is we need to unlearn some of the negative habits or prevent ourselves from being assuaged by normal misconceptions. Now, the main misconceptions that I found within auditing when I was starting out my journey in second, third year, and even in CTA is that there was no direct correlation between the time I spent studying and what the outcome was in terms of my results and how I actually performed. You see, intuitively, we are brought up in the traditional education system to believe that the more hours you put in, the more likely you are going to be successful. Unfortunately, this doesn't relate or doesn't correlate necessarily in auditing. I found that I was spending hours and hours and hours on end and thinking that I would be successful. And when the result actually came back, I would see dismal results in the 30s and 40s. And I would actually introspect and question myself and see, was there something wrong with it? Because I studied for the course, yet the results are not showing this. You'll see later on in the video why I was struggling. But ultimately, the first thing that I had to unlearn is that I had to start being effective with the time I had rather than just merely relying on the fact that I'm putting in hours. The second misconception is that the fact that I've know what the answer is and I've practiced questions, it automatically means that I can do the questions, right? So there's this disconnect that happens quite frequently in auditing. And I know many of you may be watching the video and you'll be like, Kant is absolutely correct here. You see, what will happen is that in your mind, you have an idea of what the right answer should be. And naturally, you can explain it to a lecturer and tutor and they'll be like, I agree with you. But then what happens is, like, when you actually put pen to paper, what you write is not in the solution or is not in the way that is expected. And ultimately you become frustrated. And that was me, because I was like, I did the questions, but when the result comes back, then I get comments, the way you used this verb was not correct, or the structuring of this procedure wasn't the way it was supposed to meet the audit objective. Then you get frustrated now because you're not writing in the correct way, and therefore you're not maximizing on the time you spend studying. So that's the second thing that I had to learn when I was transitioning from a poor student to a good student. I needed to understand, how do you exactly write? And writing well was very important within auditing. The third thing that I had to understand is that auditing is a very practical subject. Usually in most of our courses, they are quite theoretical. So naturally, our strengths from our traditional educational systems, even in high school, naturally allow us to do well there, because we know that if we put in the work and we study, we'll do well. But auditing is different. You get into a subject or a chapter, and then when you enter the chapter, they talk about cycles, they talk about goods received note. You've never seen a goods received note in your life. They talk about a picking slip. What is a picking slip? All this jargon, the wording that they're using, the business processes that they explain to you may become overwhelming. So then I had to realize that because auditing is so practical, I had to get that practical experience quickly. And understanding business from a practical perspective and understanding where the risks were was going to help me become successful in a subject like auditing. But how do you get this practical experience? And this brought me to my second point, or my second realization. And the second point is questions, questions, questions. Now, as we've already discussed, auditing is quite a practical subject, right? This is why, for example, if you ask many chartered accountants today and you ask them about auditing, they generally, if they've gone through the traditional auditing route, they will naturally be able to answer questions in an auditing exam quite easily, even without studying. Why? Because they've practically done it on so many equations. Imagine spending 3 years of your training experience auditing the largest companies in South Africa, in some instances in different industries. And then you're practically applying the principles. Of course, you're going to get it. Unfortunately, though, you want to graduate record time. You don't have the luxury of spending 3 years in an audit firm to get the experience in auditing and then come back to in order to pass your third year and fourth year. Then the question remains, how do I do it? I then realized quite early on that questions were the best way to be able to get the practical experience that you needed to excel in a course like auditing. Now, if I break it down, and most of you, and this includes me, when I was still a poor student, I would spend roughly about 60% of the time reading the materials and maybe 40% doing the questions. Now, I had to unlearn this way of thinking and this way of learning in such a way that I had to spend around 70% of my time doing questions and only 30% doing any lecture material. So the first thing that I had to realize that I had to learn quickly. So I utilized my classes quite effectively. So you'd find me every time when they were lecturing on a new topic, I would vigorously take down notes, and then I would equally try to flag my legislation when I get to CTA. My ISAs, I would flag my ISAs and CTA. And even in third year, I would do that and actually start studying in the lecture room. Of course, many of you might not have contact lessons. This would basically mean that you need to be more engaged in the videos that you get from an online perspective. Regardless, though, is that the key here is I had to learn quickly. And once I was done learning and doing my post reading, probably an hour or two max. I never studied auditing more than 2 hours within a week. It was always about getting the logic behind what is the main concepts that I need to get and the main topic ideas. And once I got that, I went straight into the questions. Typically, what I found is that we used to get about 5 prescribed tutorials every week. And at a minimum, I made sure that I did every single question. And this is important. Anyone struggling with auditing, watching this video, you need to do every single question, because this is how you build up your practical experience. What I found when I was doing my questions is that the first 2 questions I would do dismally. I would fail, and I had to develop this thick skin where I knew that the first few tutorials I will really get poor marks and fail dismally. By the time I get to the third and fourth tutorial, I start getting the hang of it, and I start realizing what are the nuances in terms of this topic. The key thing, though, as you go through this journey of self-discovery and you do the questions under exam pressure, understand when you get something wrong. Why did you get it wrong? That's very crucial. So as you get something wrong, you put it down and you note it down as a question, and then you go back to your ISA, you go back to the lecture material, and then try to understand, why did the solution mark it this way, and how did I miss it, so that you can actually learn. That's how you learn in auditing, building up that practical experience through doing many questions. In some instances, you may find that after doing the prescribed tutorials, you still need additional practice. And that's why you do your additional questions that are available to you. And the bottom line here is that you need to do a large volume of questions, and you need to incorporate that into your studying if you want to be successful in a subject like auditing. And I guess the third thing that was important for me is that I had to engage with my lecturers and tutors and build rapport and that relationship to do well. Very often, for intelligent people, and we're used to working alone. We're used to the fact that I have all the answers, I have the know-how, and I've got the self-discipline to be able to study. Unfortunately, for a course like auditing, because of its inherent complexities and the fact that it's so practical, it doesn't make sense to do it alone. You're setting yourself up for failure, right? At the end of the day, your lecturers or tutors are more experienced than you are, right? Especially your lecturers, they would have gone through the auditing route, they would have done it practically, and some of them might have been managers or even in senior partners within their audit firm, so they understand the nuances behind the topics. So it makes sense that if you want to be successful, you need to tap into that knowledge. The only way you can tap into that knowledge is by consulting regularly. So as you get something wrong, book time with your lecturers to go through your solutions in order to be able to understand where you are going wrong. At a minimum, I did that on a weekly basis. But in addition to that, what helped within my university is that we had people called academic trainees. I don't know about you watching this video, whether you have people called academic trainees within your systems. And perhaps if you're studying the CA route, most likely you do. These people are your go-to people. The reason why I liked academic trainees is that they are, first of all, around the same age as you. So they understand the difficulties of just having recently passed the course. They were on the ground recently, so they understand the challenges. They're about your age, they're relatable, so you can therefore be able to leverage the information much more easier, as opposed to someone more senior, more older than you, where that formal barrier might exist. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when you start being active in these tutorials, you then really start seeing the benefit. You see, a strategy that I employed to great success is that I sat down with my tutor, at that time an academic trainee, and I was quite forthright and honest in terms of my struggles within the subject. And that's the first thing. You need to be quite honest so that people can help you. So I was honest in terms of I really didn't know what was happening. But then what I started realizing, he gave me some tips, and then I was able to understand that I needed to do questions, right? The more questions I did, I now had questions when I entered the tutorial. So I always made sure that I was prepared for every single tutorial that was happening. Now, very importantly, I was engaged and active in the tutorials. So every time the tutor would ask questions, I would put up my hand. The reason why I put up my hand wherever I could is that I wanted to test the information that I'd written down in the tutorials. Sometimes the solutions are not a complete reflection of how you will get the marks in a test and exam. I found that out, that sometimes logically, if you can be able to answer questions, the lecturers are more likely to give you the marks, even if that thing is not in the solution. So I was testing out answers during my sessions with the tutors, and this was a great way to build up a logbook of potential answers in specific topics that I could use. And this helped me develop a repository so that I now was stronger when the exam came, because I understood the different alternative solutions. The second thing is that when you become more involved asking questions and answering the questions, they then actually know you. And this is human psychology. When people know you and they can be able to relate to you, they are more likely to help you as opposed to someone who's an unknown quantity. Because I was so active in my tutorial sessions, my tutor actually knew me, and my tutor actually valued the fact that I made the sessions more enjoyable because I was participating. Trust me, guys, I was also an academic trainee and a junior lecturer. It's no fun when students are not participating, but if you can make their lives easier by participating, they will definitely help you because you've helped them. So because I was more engaged, then I was able to build this relationship where every week I would actually submit a question for review. Now, what this did is that I was getting feedback real time, as opposed to everyone else who was only getting feedback when the assessments were coming in. I was actually getting feedback every time, every week, so that I already knew where my mistakes were, what I needed to work on. And naturally, then I was at an advantage in that I was building up my knowledge over time, working on my mistakes, so that by the time the exam hit or the the time the test hit, I had made so many mistakes, I had rectified them, that it was virtually impossible for me to make any more mistakes. So that's very key. Build the relationships with your lecturers and tutors. Get feedback. Talk to them. Be honest about your performance. Try to submit at least one assessment on a weekly basis and get their feedback in real time. This will then position you to do well. Another important thing that I realized is that I had to have specific strategies for the specific courses. Now, if you're an auditing student, there are specific topics within auditing that you must know. They are non-negotiable topics that will always stand you in good stead. The first one is substantive procedures. Every single assessment that I ever seen in my auditing life, whether it's in second year, third year, and fourth year, always involved substantive procedures. So it was a no-brainer for me that if I wanted to become more successful in auditing, I had to master this beast called substantive procedures, from understanding the purpose of why we were performing substantive procedures, how they fit into the ordinary audit risk model, and what the objective or the outcome would be of these procedures, and how I'd use them in the audit. All these were relevant questions that I had to ask myself. It took practice, and unlike many students who try to memorize procedures, I didn't memorize procedures. And you can actually check out this framework that I'm adding now to this video and in this chapter, which specifically looks at my specific process that I use for substantive procedure. So basically, guys, if you want to check out more about this video, make sure to continue watching here. But otherwise, if you're not an auditor or studying chartered accountancy, or you believe that you're strong in substantive procedures, you're more than welcome to skip the chapter and go to the next part of the video. So how I like to you look at this is like, let's say, for example, as you do substantive procedures, always remember the bigger picture, right? So the bigger picture is that you've got some type of statement of comprehensive income and some type of statement of financial position, right? Now, this is very important. You've already done the accounting in terms of your financial accounting subjects. So you need to lean heavily on that knowledge, because it will help you as you develop procedures and as you become more successful in auditing. At the core of an auditor, right? Think of yourself as like, here you are with your big eyes looking at these financial statements, right? You're trying to understand, like and at the core of this is that you want to provide an audit opinion, right? And what auditing is actually trying to help you is that you're managing this phenomenon called audit risk, right? There's audit risk, which is a combination of inherent risk, control risk, as well as detection risk, right? We know that you can't control these variables, right? Inherent risk being the risk before you actually consider controls. For example, if you are in a retail space, the fact that there's a large volume of transactions means that there might be theft, or there might be items that potentially get broken, and that might influence valuation. Control risk has to do what are the processes that management has put in place, and whether those processes are actually effective in preventing and detecting material misstatements. And then obviously the only thing you as an auditor can control is what we call detection risk. So the ISAs that you basically learn, right, throughout your studies are basically helping you with this phenomenon of how do you manage your detection risk. Because ultimately you want to lower audit risk being the risk that I provide an incorrect audit opinion, right? You want to make sure that this is as low as possible. You visually look at it like this so that you understand where auditing fits in that everything I'm learning is trying to manage audit risk, and specifically trying to help me design procedures and the like, so that I can be able to lower detection risk to an acceptable level, so that my audit risk is also acceptable. Cool. And then how I used to look at it, particularly in the form of substantive procedures, right? I used to visually interpret and look at these financials and say, okay, when I get a question, for example, if they say I must audit revenue, I know that I'm specifically looking at this line item in the statement of comprehensive income. And then I understand that management is making assertions in relation to this line item. And we used to call these OCA assertions, right? Management is saying that we believe that our revenue has actually occurred, that we believe that it's complete, we believe that it's recorded in the correct period, which is what we call cutoff, that we believe that it's classified correctly, which is what we call classification, and that we believe that it's accurate. Now, specifically, these are the assertions that management makes as it pertains to items in the income statement. And your job as an auditor, basically, to firstly get an understanding of what is the risk level at each assertion level. So, for example, as part of my audit risk assessment, because everything in auditing is all about audit risk. And once I understand what the audit risk is, then what I specifically do is that I assess what is the risk for that line item that I'm auditing, right, for that specific assertion. Now, if we think about revenue and we're auditing revenue, most likely occurrence will probably be a high risk because let's face it, what entity doesn't want to make revenue and money? And obviously they want to inflate it, and there's that risk of fraud. Then potentially completeness might be a lower risk, but because why wouldn't an entity record revenue? But in some instances, it can be a high risk, especially when you've got large volume of transactions and things like that, and they could miss things. Then perhaps cutoff might be a medium risk, classification might also be a medium risk, and then you might say accuracy is also a high risk, right? Because of the complexity of the standard IFRS 15. So you've done your risk assessment. This is what you would have done in the preliminary phase of your auditing when you were doing your risk assessment and planning. Now, then, when you design procedures, audit procedures, substantive procedures, you want to address firstly the assertions that have the highest risk. So in this case, occurrence and accuracy, and then work your way down to those with the medium risk, cutoff and classification, and then conclude with the one with the least risk. And that's how you want to deal with those type of questions of substantive procedures, really understanding the risk and scoring the majority of the marks on the items that have the higher risk. And then one thing that will definitely help you when you design audit procedures is how you actually frame them. So we talked about big picture, what are we trying to achieve? Then we talked about the different assertions, right? And obviously this is only the transaction assertions. If they asked you to audit PPE, the assertions would be different. Like we talk about, when you talk about PPE, we talk about serve or assets and liability. We talk about serve assertions. Just serve would be, the C would be completeness, right? The E would be existence. The R would be rights and obligations, and then the V would be valuations. Now, again, management is making assertions by the mere fact of them preparing the statement of financial position. They are positing that we believe all our assets and liabilities are complete, that they actually exist, that we have the rights in relation to our assets, and that they have the obligations in relation to they have the obligation in relation to their liabilities. And then they also make the assertion that we believe our assets and liabilities have been valued correctly, right? So these are the assertions. And again, your job as an auditor would be to assess the risk. Now, obviously, probably from a PPE perspective, right, we'd expect existence to have a higher risk because management might want to inflate assets in order to reflect a higher position in their financials. So inherently, one would usually look at PPE as a higher risk, whereas completeness again would be a lower risk, right? Because what company wouldn't want to show all of its assets when they have them, right? But again, I caveat this because every entity is different. You have to look at the scenario. In some instances, completeness might be an issue, particularly where transactions are complex, high, large volume, where they might miss things. Then rights and obligations, perhaps medium risk, and then valuation, really a higher risk, right? But maybe not so, maybe for PPE potentially, but maybe this PPE is sort of like specialized and there's a lot of complexity, borrowing costs, construction, and things like that that are complex. And that's why we've made it a higher risk. Okay, cool. So then similarly, now you then have an idea as an auditor and say, I need to focus on my procedures on the higher risks, right? Design my procedures accordingly, and then work my way down to those with the lower risk. Boom. Now, the next question is, how would you go about, what framework did I use when I was thinking about designing substantive procedures, right? Particularly test of details, because it's such an important section. And I guess I want to share maybe a snapshot, but if you guys like these type of videos and you want me to go deeper into sort of technical type of things, then let me know in the comment section and perhaps we could expand on it. I just want to highlight and give you a flavor. Okay. Now, how I used to think about it is like this. So how I used to, let's say the question asked me that I needed to audit revenue, right? Now, at the core of this, the first thing that I would do is, right, we know that if I'm doing test of details, what they're basically doing is that I've got my statement of comprehensive income. I know my revenue, here it is, and it's probably sitting at maybe 10 million for an entity, right? Now, specifically within that 10 million, I know the assertions that management is making. They're saying that we believe this 10 million has occurred, that it's recorded in the correct period, cutoff, that is classified accordingly, that is complete, and that it's actually accurate, right? That's what management is basically saying. Now, as they make that assertion, my job is to basically test it. Now, how would I go about testing those assertions? Now, I already have a risk level, and I probably know that this is higher risk, and maybe this is medium. Cutoff is medium, classification is medium, maybe this one we call it completeness, and then this one is sort of like a lower risk. Now, the first thing you need to understand is that when you actually think about the audit process, right, you need to understand that the core is actually understanding your population, right? Your population is everything. Because in auditing, it's not feasible to test every single line item. And that's what test of details are doing. You're designing procedures to get direct audit evidence over a particular line item. However, let's face it, perhaps in that population, and if we think about, let's say, a car business, right? And I enjoy car businesses. And let's say this revenue split into two, we call car sales, and there's what we call rentals, right? And that's a model that most of the rental companies use, like Hertz, Avis, right? And then let's say car sales consists of maybe 6 million, and then rentals probably consists of 4 million of this population. Now, within the car sales, I might have a list that represents all the sales of that I've made throughout the period. And it could be that this list consists of maybe I've sold 10,000 cars in the period, right? At specific sales points and prices that got me to this. So, and then for rentals, I might have entered into maybe 20,000 rental transactions, right? The price point for rentals is lower. So the volume of transactions would basically be higher than car sales. Cool. In order to get that revenue. Now, if you think about it in that light, now, first of all, we'd probably have opening procedures, right? And don't make that mistake because most of the students, they want to memorize these procedures. Don't memorize them. Think about it conceptually. So what I used to think about is that I have opening procedures. Why am I performing opening procedures? Typically, it's for two reasons. The first reason is that I want to get comfort, number one, that the data that management is giving me is actually accurate. And secondly, I want to make sure that my starting point of the information I'm using is actually a correct basis to do that. So naturally, when you think about opening procedures, that's why we say agree the opening balance, right? You've probably heard that procedures over and over again. Agree the opening balance from your GL to the closing balance, right? From last year's like working papers or audited financials. The reason why they say that is that I want to make sure that the data that I'm getting is actually complete, right? Similarly, they'll say that I want to request a listing, right? A sales listing, but why are you requesting that sales listing? I'm requesting that sales listing because perhaps it gives me more granularity in terms of how many transactions happened to get this revenue item. So this listing is important so that I can understand how the revenue was generated so that I can potentially pick samples and test accordingly. So again, if management gives me a document, and this is like the principle, like whether I get a fixed asset register, a sales listing, always need to make sure that that listing is accurate and complete. So obviously, I'm not going to write down the procedures now, but like I can say them, right? Like for example, you'd say from management requests the sales listing and agree the total per the sales listing to the total that's sitting on my GL for revenue to ensure that the items are complete. Right. So in our case, because we've got two revenue streams, we'd get a sales listing for car sales, we get a sales listing for rental sales. Then we'd agree the total on the car sales listing to the total sales in the general ledger for car sales. Then we'd agree the total on the rental sales listing, and then we'd agree that total to the total per the general ledger and ensure that the items are the same as evidence that the data that management is giving us is complete, right? Then the next thing that we do in that specific listing would cost and cross-cost that listing to ensure that the information that we're getting is accurate, right? So when you're costing, you're basically adding everything up and cross-costing to ensure that the data is accurate. Cool. Those are sort of like your general procedures. Then the other general procedures that they talk about, like for example, your accounting policies, right? And basically, there's a specific ISA about this accounting policies where we talk about opening balance testing, where you basically say you want to agree accounting policies in the draft financials this year to last year's accounting policies to ensure that they've been consistently applied. Where there are changes, you want to ensure that those changes are in line with IFRS and that they've been accounted for correctly. So there's not a lot of marks and general procedures. But it's always great to know them and then score the marks accordingly in order to be able to maximize. Then the next thing is actually thinking about the procedures. And how I used to think about the procedures is that I used to draw a T account, right? So when you draw your T account, it helps you visually understand how you got to the number, because at the core of your auditing is basically testing that the individual transactions that make up this item were accounted for accordingly. So, for example, I know that potentially I might have cash sales, which is bank, and I might have credit sales, which is accounts receivable. Maybe, for example, definitely all our car sales might be in cash, and then a potential our rental sales. So maybe in this business is very cash. This business might be very cash intensive. So maybe 8 million is bank, and then accounts receivable is basically 2 million, right? So so now I've got a framework to say, okay, these are the transactions that probably came about. And yeah, and I want to audit it now, right? So always visually look at a sales account. Of course, depending on what you auditing, right, the T account becomes more and more important. Like, of course, in this example, we're looking at sales. But think about if you were auditing something like PPE, right? You'd still draw your T account, right? You'd have your opening balance here, then you have your closing balance here. Then you'd have like bank, which is additions. Then you'd have like on credit, maybe you've got like your loans that you've taken out by buying PP on credit. These are all additions. Then you might have depreciation, which reduces. Then you might have impairments, right? Then you might have disposals. All of these potential transactions that are affecting PPE that's recognized in a cost model. So when you perform procedures for your PPE, when we talk about those serve assertions, you're basically testing this. You basically so this opening balance, right? This would be your initial procedures. This is where you perform your initial procedures. So basically for PPE, the initial procedures would be agreeing the opening balance on PPE to last year's closing balance per the working papers, agreeing this year's closing balance on PPE to the draft financial statements as well as the trial balance to ensure it's complete. But equally, then inspecting the accounting policies that they've been accounted for correctly from year to year and they've been carried over. And then also getting a rep letter around the assertions around PPE. But equally, when you then test the closing balance, that's when you actually do your testing on your serve. Like when you test existence, you test rights and obligations, you test valuation, you test completeness, right? Then in addition to actually testing the closing balance, right? And basically scoring marks, you're also going to test the depreciation. Like, is the depreciation accurate? You're going to test disposals. This is how you're going to score the marks. And this is how I used to think about auditing. Can you see that when you start thinking three-dimensionally and understand these are all the specific procedures you could perform, how many marks are you potentially getting here? There's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 marks at minimum just on the transactions alone. And then already you're going to get marks on testing the closing balances. So think about it that way. And that's how I used to approach it. And of course, obviously, the detailed testing of how we do this thing is out of the scope of this video. And potentially you guys can let me know if you want us to go deeper. But I want to highlight how you potentially should be thinking about substantive procedures. Do your T accounts, test your balances and your transactions so that you can maximize the amount of marks. Other thing that is important, where I see a lot of students getting this wrong, is that they don't specifically have a good understanding or foundation of cycles. So when you understand the cycles, it becomes easier to design your procedures. So make sure you're strong in your cycle. So for example, sales would be covered by the revenue and receipt cycle. PPE would be covered by the investment cycle. If you understand how that cycle works, what the documents are, then it becomes easier to design your procedures, right? Like, for example, we know that typically for substantive procedures, either we've got to inspect something, right? Or we need to recalculate it. We may inquire, although that's not a strong audit procedures. Yeah, so usually we inspect, we recalculate, we may have to inquire, right? But of course, these are the most strongest procedures. So you won't be able to design these procedures if you don't understand the cycle. So for example, how would I go about testing cash sales, right? I'll give you a framework. So I know in the revenue receipt cycle, that maybe the entity before I make sales, right? What they need to do is that a customer needs to they do a check on the customer. So they check to see do they have an offer from the bank for financing and whether they're eligible to buy the car. If that financing has been approved, then based on that offer to purchase, then they then get the details of the customer, including all the pertinent IDs and everything. Then what happens is that the customer signs the OTP as well as the bank confirms that they'll provide financing for the car. Once that happens, then the customer signs the delivery note and the OTP as evidence that they now have the car in their possession. So if you think about it, if I'm going to test car sales, I will basically look at it and say, okay, give me the car sales listing. Then I'm going to get the car sales listing. Then for each car sales, what I'm going to do is that potentially I know that the process is that for each sale that takes place, there should be an approved OTP, there should be an invoice, there should be a customer signed delivery note, right? So then I'm going to select a sample, and for that sample, I'm going to inspect that there's a corresponding signed delivery note and that there's a corresponding signed OTP that supports that transaction as evidence that it took place. So how you'd word it is that of sales transactions recorded right on the sales journal, request management provide you with the corresponding signed customer delivery notes and offer to purchases as evidence that the transaction did take place. That gives me evidence over occurrence. Now, there's no ways you could have designed that procedure if you didn't understand the cycle. Usually the cycle comes from the scenario, but you also need to fill in the blanks based on your understanding. That's why I'm saying a strong foundation of cycles will help you develop these procedures. In addition, right, as you start getting more strong or confident, you start saying, oh, but then there's also that risk of fraud in that the sale could have taken place, but I need extra evidence because of the fact that this is a fraud. Management could have forged the signatures, right? It's possible that they forged customer signatures. So to test specifically fraud risk in occurrence, because it's such a significant risk, in addition, what I could do for that sample of sales transactions that take place, what I also do is that by inspection, I trace these sales invoices to the bank statement as evidence that the cash was received from the customer or the bank that finances the customer. That's strong audit evidence, right? Because we know that the business is car sales and they get cash. So it wouldn't make sense to have a sale and then there's no corresponding cash that entered the bank statement. So that's why I was for a sample of sales transactions that was taking place, I was by inspection tracing it to the bank statement as evidence that it was received as that extra evidence to address fraud. Cool. So obviously, guys, this is you get what I'm saying, right? Understand the cycles. Okay, let's leave it here. So substantive procedures, very important. Right. In addition to substantive procedures, other topics that are non-negotiables that you need to know is Companies Act, right? First of all, when I used to analyze a scenario, I was always on the lookout for Companies Act. The reason why Companies Act was important, it triggered other things that had a lot of marks. So for example, if a company was non-compliant with the Companies Act and potentially the impact was material, this could result in a reportable irregularity or non-compliance. And these were further marks. Guys, let me tell you, in some questions, they can be very sneaky in that they'll just say, assess the impact on the audit. But now they don't really tell you that actually there was non-compliance here. And therefore, you have to consider whether this is a reportable irregularity and non-compliance. So you have to have a strong foundation of Companies Act. And I don't mean reading the entirety of the Companies Act. There are certain sections that get examined all the time. Like, for example, for me, the Section 40s were key, like Section 40, 41, 42, 44, 45, 46. Those were really key in my books. And then the earlier sections like understanding solvency and liquidity test, understanding, special resolutions. When is a special resolution required? Then understanding like directors' conduct. What is the role of directors? What do they play? And what happens when directors don't act in the best interest of the company? I found that also reckless trading was also a common one, like Section 23. Section 22, understanding and the link between going concern and that standard. These are the sort of sections that I'm talking about that you have to really grasp and understand them so that you can be successful within an audit space, right? The other topics are risk assessment. Guys, this is the bedrock of auditing. We audit based on risk. So it's a non-negotiable. You need to understand risk, how to write risk. And sometimes people don't even know how to word risks correctly, right? Like, for example, there's a risk factor, and then there's the impact, whether it increases or decreases your risk. For example, if the company is listed, you will say that AB Limited is listed on the JSE. This increases the risk of material misstatement overall, because management might have an incentive to inflate assets and deflate your liabilities in order to show a more favorable outcome so that the share price can increase, right? These are the type of things I'm talking about. Another thing could be at an, let's say that is an overall level, but how could I word that risk in terms of the assertion level? Let's say, for example, I've got inventory and I'm importing it from another country. So there are two risks that I can identify. They're from this risk factor. So understanding that from risk factors, you can have multiple marks that you can earn. So you basically write there in your test that the company or A Limited is importing its inventory from China, right? Then you put two sub-points, say this increases risk of material misstatements for the following reasons. Number one, there's an increased chance that the entity may by mistake not have capitalized all the costs of importation and transportation and getting the inventory to a present location and condition as required by IS2 inventory. That is one mark for valuation. Then you put valuation in brackets. Then secondly, there's an increased risk that the foreign inventory was not translated correctly using the correct rules in terms of IS21 due to the complexity of that standard. There's another mark there. So understanding that when you have a risk, you identify a risk factor and then be able to understand whether it increases or decreases the risk, and then ultimately linking it to the financial statements overall. And then like what I did with the overall risk assessment, where I said overstating assets and understating liabilities, and how I basically said incorrect capitalization, or I used wording like incorrect translation of amounts so that it linked to the assertion or the financial statements in general. That's the type of things you need to practice, guys. Risk assessments are crucial. In addition to that, I also found controls very important, right? These are marks that you can score easily. So controls, manual controls, understand application controls like your edit checks, your limit checks, sign checks, all those IT controls. So there's a link there between those controls and the cycles as well as substantive procedures. Having a strong foundation of cycles is key, guys. So understand all your business processes from revenue receipt cycle, purchases and payable, payroll, investment, all those cycles. And sometimes I found like my other friends used to have these drawings in their rooms of the different cycles and flow charts. If that works for you, do that. For me, I found that the more questions I was doing, I started now understanding the different cycles within the context of questions. Whatever works for you, just try to basically immerse yourself in those cycles because they're important. They help you identify weaknesses and controls. They help you develop your substantive procedures, right? So, and then of course, once you've got the hang of those topics, then there are also your bespoke topics. I'm not saying they're not important, but they basically do get you marks. Like ethics as well. I almost forgot. Ethics is key. You have to know ethics, guys. So I would also get a foundation of ethics. Understand King. It's easy marks. And because of where the questioning is going now from a cycle level and ITC level, they're asking more ethical questions. So understanding King, understanding CPC, especially in a scenario where chartered accountants are involved, is also key, right? And then, of course, your bespoke topics, you then need to know as well, like pre-engagement, all your finalization topics, execution topics, recon, all of those, you still need to know them. And I guess in third year, right, what you need to understand that they're probably going to ask you principles. So focus on the principles, right? So topics like substantive procedures, controls, test of controls, control weaknesses, these topics, risk assessments, will tend to be asked quite heavily, as opposed to your fourth year where now it's an open book exam. They'll start asking more bespoke questions like going concern, how do you actually audit groups, audit opinions, material misstatements, all of those topics, auditing estimates, financial instruments, share-based payments, right? So once you understand that, then it helps guide you. So in third year, focus on the principles, practice, practice, practice. Then when you get to fourth year, you must still practice, practice, practice. But then obviously you've got the luxury of the book. So practice using the book so that you can get used to it. Now, the final advice that I want to give you is basically general advice. So the general advice that I have is threefold, right? The first thing that I would tell you is that don't take audit results personally, right? Most of the time we will struggle in something like auditing. It's very rare for people to get the correct answers on day one. So don't be shy. If you see that I haven't achieved the objectives that are required, don't feel like it's an indictment on yourself or your ability, but rather understand that you simply didn't get that. So get a deep dive, understand where you get wrong, sit with a lecturer and tutor and solve the problems. The second thing that I would advise you is that try to do vacation work, especially if you struggle with understanding the practical side of auditing and what you're trying to achieve. Sometimes when you go into a real audit and you interact with real audit members, you'll then get immersed in terms of what you're supposed to understand. And the more you interact with those situations, the more you'll then appreciate what auditing is trying to achieve. I found that this helped when I went for vacation work, working for a top audit firm. This helped me understand from a business perspective what audit was all about and what it achieved, and gave me a greater appreciation so that I could become more successful in my auditing study. The third thing and most important thing, never ever give up. You see, auditing is one of those subjects where you're going to struggle a lot. But ultimately, what makes sense and what will make the difference is your ability to continue regardless of adversity. You see, I've got a lot of friends that had done auditing and basically failed test one, they failed test two, failed test three, and failed all the assessments. And then only at the final exam where they actually got a good mark and passed the year. And that might happen with you. That's why you've got to have the perseverance. As long as you're improving and growing, that's all that counts. You went from 30% in test one to 40% in test two, maybe finally 50% in test three, so that you have the confidence going into the final exam that now you can get 60 or 70%. That's what auditing is about. Don't give up. Put in place the mechanisms like consulting with lecturers, going over your weaknesses that we talked about so that you can be more successful. Hopefully now, guys, you are better appreciating auditing and now you're better equipped to be successful in it. Let's chat in the comments section. What other auditing techniques do you have that help you excel in the subject? Let's share in the community. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Let's share it as well. And hopefully we can make an impact. And finally, you can conquer auditing, whether you're in second, third year, or fourth year, so that your journey of a chartered accountancy can become a reality. Okay, guys, until we meet again, remember, I believe in you. You can do it. Bye.